Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for tuning in this evening for our online Bible study. Let's get into it. I welcome you. If you are new to this study or new to the church, my name is Dave St. Alban, and I'm the senior pastor here at Thoburn United Methodist Church. It's a joy to be with you here this evening. Tonight, we will be looking at the book of Judges, chapter 8. So I invite you to grab your Bibles, open them up to Judges 8, grab something to take some good notes with. Grab a beverage and grab a snack, and let's get into it. Well, again, welcome and thanks for tuning in this evening. I pray that you've been having a wonderful day today. And I do appreciate you being here and being part of this online study with so many others all across our online platforms and our virtual classroom here. It is truly a blessing to be able to journey through the Bible with you as we are doing a chapter at a time with you here live and with many others who tune in at a later time and date. Not everybody is online at the same time, and so I thank you. Whether you are here right now or at a different time or day, thank you for being here. We are in the book of Judges, and tonight we're looking at chapter 8. Just to recap where we were at last night, we looked at the victory of Gideon and the Israelites over the Midianites. And tonight we're going to see resentment coming from the tribe of Ephraim. And then at the end of this study, we will look at the death of Gideon and then prepare for our next judge, which we will start looking at tomorrow in chapter 9. So we've witnessed this transformation of Gideon from a fearful person to a fearless agent of God who is willing to take on the enemy against all odds. And now we're going to see him operating as a diplomat, so to speak. This is a transformation that is taking place in the life of Gideon, but it's not going to be a transformation that's going to go entirely in the right direction. Gideon is going to be viewed towards the end of his days as a bit of a tyrant, as a bit of a self-absorbed person, and ruthless in how he handles dealing with his fellow Israelites, his fellow countrymen. Remember, the name Gideon means hacking, and this name that he was given, this nickname he was given, Jerub-Baal, means contending with the enemy. So rather than hacking and contending with the enemy, now we are going to see Gideon hacking and contending with his own people. Now, what is the problem that we're going to see here tonight is that Gideon had not invited the soldiers of the tribe of Ephraim to join him. When they were going into battle and chasing down the Midianites, Gideon reached out to the tribes of Manasseh, from which he was from, and Asher and Zebulun and Naphtali, but not the Ephraimites. In chapter 6, verse 35, he sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling to arms the soldiers of Manasseh and also to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. Now, why didn't he invite the Ephraimites? Well, presumably, he didn't invite them because of the Lord's direction. Maybe he did not need any more soldiers helping him out. But the soldiers of Ephraim, they took issue with this. They saw this omission of an invitation to join them in battle as an insult. And they were going to begin arguing with Gideon vigorously, is what we're going to see. So let's get into it here. Open up to Judges chapter 8. If you don't have a Bible with you, not a problem. We'll put all the verses up here on the screen, and you can follow along. Lots to talk about tonight. So take some good notes, and let's get into it here. Verse 1. Now the Ephraimites, the tribe of Ephraim, asked Gideon, "Why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight against Midian?" And they challenged him vigorously. Now Ephraim as a tribe was jealous, very jealous of the tribe of Manasseh. And remember, Manasseh is where Gideon was from. Gideon had made war upon the enemy and had defeated them without the cooperation of his fellow Israelites in the tribe of Ephraim. Ephraim was striving to achieve a leadership position within the nation of Israel. So they're questioning Gideon, why did you exclude us? And Gideon here, we're going to see, takes on the role of a diplomat. And he does so in a very good way, to the point that he satisfies the Ephraimites with a very clever compliment. Verse 2. So Gideon responded, "Well, what have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grape harvest of Abiezer?" We'll talk about that in just a moment. God gave Oreb and Zeeb, the Midianite leaders, into your hands. And what was I able to do compared to what you were able to do? And at this, their resentment subsided. So he's paying them a compliment, acting very diplomatically here. And what he's saying is the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim. That refers to the spoils of war that the Ephraimites took from the fleeing Midianites. The harvest of Abiezer refers to the Midianites that Gideon and his 300 soldiers had defeated. And so what he's saying is the Ephraimites' victory was way better than Gideon's victory. Gideon and his army, yes, they defeated the Midianites, but the Ephraimites had killed these two top commanders, Oreb and Zeeb, which we saw last night. So he's basing his response to the Ephraimites' anger on psychology. He's paying them a compliment, whereas he should have used theology. Notice here that Gideon made no reference to God, no reference to God's provision, no reference to God's victory. This was all done psychologically. He's acting as a diplomat, but he's totally excluded God from the picture. So again, what we saw last night was Gideon claiming part of this victory for himself, and here he's doing the same thing. He's excluding the victor, God, from his own victory, from God's victory. Look at what I did, and then look at what you did, which was so much greater, Ephraim. How can I compare to you? So Gideon was faithful to God. He was humble in the presence of others, but he was becoming prideful. And this is a theme that we're going to see from here on out with these judges of Israel. Things are going to continue to go very bad for not just the judges, but the Israelites. So Gideon followed up victory over the Midianites with a second military campaign. And this one is a dramatic contrast to what we saw last night over the Midianites. Here, we're going to see Gideon pursuing two Midianite kings. And he's going to catch them and kill them. And then he's going to punish two cities of his fellow Israelites. So we're going to see no involvement of God here, no mention Gideon is acting on his own, and he's here to settle a private score. And we're going to see that in just a little bit. So let's continue in this chapter. Gideon and his 300 men, which was his army, were exhausted from chasing the fleeing Midianites, but they kept up the pursuit. And they came to the Jordan River and they crossed it. And Gideon said to the men of Sukkot, this was the first city that they entered. This was Israel territory. This was the tribe of Ephraim. He said to these men of Sukkot, give my troops some bread. They are worn out from this pursuit, and I am still pursuing these two kings, Zebah and, excuse me, and Zalmunna, these kings of Midian. But the officials in Sukkot said, do you already have the hands of these two kings, Zebah and Zalmunna, in your possession? Why should we give bread to your troops? And then Gideon replied, just for that, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hands, I'm going to tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars. Now he's got a grudge. Now he has a score to settle with Sukkot. We'll come back to this in a little bit. Verse 8, from Sukkot, Gideon went up to Peniel, another city, made the same request of them. Give my men some bread. We are exhausted from pursuing these fleeing Midianites. But the men of Peniel had the same response as the men of Sukkot. Why should we give you bread? So Gideon, said to the men of Peniel, when I return in triumph from defeating these two kings, I'm going to tear down this tower. Now Sukkot and Peniel, two cities that were on the east side of the Jordan River. And the residents of these two cities lived closer in vicinity to the Midianites than most of the Israelites did. So there may have been some kind of alliance between the people of Sukkot and Peniel with the Midianites. If so, then it's very easy to understand why they didn't want to assist Gideon and jeopardize that alliance. But in denying Gideon this bread, there's an expression of fear here by these two cities. Cowardice that the Midianites were going to take vengeance on them if they helped out their fellow Israelites. And there was also a contempt against this small tribe that Gideon had. There's a sense of regionalism that's starting to develop within the Israelite tribes. That's something entirely new for them. That's occurred since the days of Joshua, when they were united as one people within the promised land. Now these Israelites that live to the east of the Jordan River, these Transjordanian Israelites, they were showing no sense of brotherhood, no sense of national responsibility. Their lack of cooperation with Gideon illustrates exactly what both Moses and Joshua feared was going to happen to the Israelites living to the east of the Jordan River, with Moses in the book of Numbers chapter 32, with Joshua in the book of Joshua chapter 22. Both men, Moses and Joshua, had a fear that this was going to happen with these tribes that stayed east of the Jordan. So now these seeds of national disunity and disintegration were not only planted, now they were starting to grow. And again, things are going to go very bad for the Israelites here from here on out through the next several books that we're going to look at. So in verse 10, Zebah and Zalmunna, these two kings of Midian, they were in Karkor. Karkor was a city. The name Karkor means soft ground or even ground. They were in this city Karkor with a force of about 15,000 men, all that were left of the armies of the eastern peoples. Remember, there were 135,000 of these Midianite soldiers. Now there's only 15,000 left. 120,000 swordsmen had fallen. So Gideon went up by the route of the nomads, east of Nobah and Yogbaha, and attacked this army of 15,000, this unsuspecting army. And so these kings, Zebah and, Zalmunna, the two kings of Midian, they flee again. They're on the run again. But Gideon pursues them, captures them, and routs this entire army of 15,000. Even though Gideon was denied provisions from his brothers in Sukkot and Peniel, he continued to pursue these remaining Midianite soldiers, 15,000 of them, caught up with them, attacked them by surprise. Maybe these soldiers never expected Gideon to pursue them this deep into the Transjordanian area. This was 20 miles east of the Jordan River. It was 50 miles from where this pursuit started. So perhaps these Midianite soldiers never anticipated Gideon pursuing them for 50 miles. Regardless, he surprised them, attacked them, routed them, and captured these two kings. Now, the names of the kings, Zebah and Zalmunna. Zebah means victim, and Zalmunna means protection that is refused. And these may have been nicknames rather than common names, similar to what we saw in chapter 3 with the king Cushan, where the Israelites nicknamed him Cushan Rishath Ta'im, meaning doubly dangerous. But these are the names of these kings: Zebah and Zalmunna, victim, and protection refused. This capture of these kings, this was for Gideon pure gloating. He was seeking the highest honor and the greatest glory that he could achieve, and he obtained it here with the capture of these two kings. Now, it's interesting in this whole account of Gideon, God was the victor in the battle over the Midianites, but Gideon put God in the place of the winner of the bronze medal. He won the victory over the Midianites. The Ephraimites, who started this chapter by arguing with Gideon, they got the silver medal. They killed these two leaders, Oreb and Zeeb. But Gideon could claim the gold, right? He captured these two kings, Zebah and Zalmunna. This is the beginning of this trend of self-interest and revenge among not just Gideon, but the later judges that we're going to look at. This once timid man, Gideon, has now become a violent tyrant. He's an instigator. And for the first time in this book of Judges, he's going to bring this military action against his fellow Israelites. And that's an action that is going to continue to get worse as this book of Judges progresses. So Gideon, remember, he's got a grudge against Sukkot and Peniel for denying provisions to his people. Verse 13. So Gideon, son of Joash, returned from the battle of capturing these two kings by the pass of Heres. The pass of Heres was a inclined pathway or a roadway, some kind of a pass that led to this town, Heres, but along the way were these cities of Sukkot and Peniel. Verse 14. First, Gideon caught a young man of Sukkot, questioned him, interrogated him, and the young man wrote down for him the names of 77 officials of Sukkot, the elders of the town. Now, that in itself is an indication that this was a well advanced area for a young person to be able to write, and for Gideon to be able to read it means that they were very well advanced at this time. But first, he interrogates this young man of Sukkot and gets names, right? Give me some names. Then he came to these elders, these 77 men of Sukkot, and he said to them, here are these two kings, Zebah and Zalmunna, that you taunted me with by saying, do you already have the hands of these kings in your possession? Why should we give you bread to your exhausted men? So now he's coming back with a grudge. Remember what you said? Well, now I have them. So he took these 77 elders of the town and taught them a lesson by punishing them with desert thorns and briars. In verse 17, he also pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of that town. Gideon's severe punishment of the men of these towns, his brothers, his fellow Israelites, it may have been deserved, it may have been just because of their taunting him. They had refused to assist this leader that God had chosen. They refused to help this judge in this holy war. And in reality, it was Gideon's duty as a judge to punish people that would stand in the way of helping him in this holy war. But what you can't miss is the ruthlessness that Gideon has with his brothers, with his fellow Israelites. When Gideon was arguing with God about how am I going to do this? Show me some signs. God was gracious. God was patient. Now we have these fellow Israelites doing the same thing to Gideon, and he's acting in a very tyrannical, ruthless way by torturing these men, killing them, destroying objects within their city. Now, if Peniel and Sukkot were Canaanite cities, that would probably be justified. These were his brothers. These were fellow Israelites. So now Gideon's character is being transformed again. Now he's acting like a out-of-control general. No longer bound by any rules, any national loyalty. Now he's becoming almost as a dictator. And he had no issue in torturing his brothers, his fellow Israelites, in killing anybody who doubted him. That's a sharp contrast to the treatment he received from Yahweh when he doubted. Gideon is going through a very bad transformation here, and now he's acting very tyrannical to the point where he kills his fellow Israelites. Then he turns to the judges, to the kings, rather. He turns to these two kings, verse 18, and he asks Zebah and Zalmunna, what were the men like that you killed at Tabor? And they replied, men like you. Each of these men had the bearing of a prince. Gideon's asking, what did they look like? These men that you killed at Tabor. And they said, they look just like you. Gideon replies, verse 19, those were my brothers. Those were the sons of my mother. And as surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I would have spared yours. Gideon took his prisoners, these two kings, back to Ophrah, where he was from, where these events took place, that these two kings killed his brothers. Now these two kings are in Gideon's custody. apparently killing his brother sometime before this battle against the Midianites. Maybe it was during one of those raids that took place over the period of 7 years that we looked at early on in this account, where the Midianites came in, routed the land, stole the provisions. For 7 years they did this. Maybe that's when this killing of his brothers took place. Whenever it happened, up until this point, Gideon had not been able to avenge the death of his brothers. But now he has the upper hand. Now he's captured these two kings. And he probably would not have applied the eye for an eye, life for life payback law if his brothers died in battle. But they didn't. They were murdered by these two kings of Midian. So verse 20, turning to Jether, his oldest son, Gideon's oldest son, he said to his son, kill these men. But Jether did not draw his sword because he was only a boy and he was afraid. So Zebah and Zalmunna said to Gideon, do it yourself. As is the man, so is his strength. In other words, don't send a boy to do your work for you. If you're going to do it yourself. So he did. Gideon stepped forward, killed them, and took the ornaments off of their camels' necks. We'll talk about that in a moment. But why his son? Why did he ask his son to kill them? Well, that would have been a great disgrace to die at the hand of either a woman or a youth in this time period, in this part of the world, the ancient Near East, because what that implied was that the person who was killed was not able to overcome the person killing him. So in other words, this young boy killing these two kings would have meant that these two kings had no ability to defeat a young boy. Very humiliating. So Gideon's intent was not just to kill these kings. Gideon's intent was to kill them in humiliation because of what they did to his brothers. And how he was going to go about this was by having his son kill them. But he couldn't. Gideon's young son, he was not ready for this work. He couldn't do the work of an adult because he was such a young boy. So Gideon did it himself. Now, the reluctancy of this young boy, what this resembles is Gideon as he was. What we are going to see in the next king, Abimelech, which is the half-brother of Jether, the half-brother of Gideon's young son, Abimelech, is going to resemble Gideon as he will become. Now, what about these ornaments on the camels' necks? Well, these crescent-shaped ornaments that Gideon took from the king's camels, presumably they were gold and silver. These ornaments would have been valuable, but really they'd have been very valuable because they belonged to kings. This type of ornament, this crescent, it's mentioned only in the Bible here and in Isaiah chapter 3. So this is a unique reference in Scripture. So with the execution of Zebah and Zalmunna, these two kings, the destruction of Oreb and Zeeb, the leaders, with the destruction of the army of 135,000, Midian's domination of Israel has come to a close. This 7 years of oppression, it was not as long as some of the other periods where the Israelites endured oppression, but these 7 years were an unusual, overwhelming oppression. But now that time period has come to an end, and so we come to, again, a time of peace. And the events that we're going to look at next presumably immediately followed what just took place. But they would have even greater significance later on in Israel's history. So, verse 22, the Israelites said to Gideon, rule over us, judge you, your son, your grandson, rule over us because you have saved us from the hand of Midian. So, this supernatural victory that God had given his people elevated Gideon into this national spotlight, right? Rule over us. Some of the Israelites even invited Gideon to be their king, to begin a dynasty of kings. You and your son and your grandson rule over us. Be these kings, this dynasty. But Gideon told them, I will not. I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. So Gideon, in this flattering offer, he refused, which was a wise thing to do, but he still didn't give credit to God, as Deborah had done back in chapter 5. Gideon is playing this role of, oh, well, God will rule over you, not me, but he's still not crediting God. In verse 24, he said, I do have one request of you, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder of this war over the Midianites. It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. We'll talk about that in just a second. The people answered, we will be glad to do that. We'll be glad to give you an earring. So they spread out a garment on the ground, and each of them threw a gold earring from this plunder onto this garment on the ground. And the weight of the gold, verse 26, came to 1,700 shekels, which is about 40 to 70 pounds, depending on which weight of shekel was being referred to here. Just take on average 60 pounds of gold, a lot of gold, not counting the ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian or the chains that were on their camels' necks. These are just the earrings, 60 pounds of gold being tossed onto this garment. And from this, Gideon made an ephod. Now, Gideon made this ephod from some of this jewelry that the Israelites had thrown onto this garment. Now, the writer calls the Midianites here Ishmaelites. And that's just a term that is used to loosely describe any nomadic group. So the Ishmaelites are indeed the Midianites, and their army, the peoples that were destroyed. So the plunder is coming from the Midianites. And these grateful Israelites who just wanted to elevate Gideon to a king and start this dynasty, he said, no, I won't do that, but give me your gold. Sure, here it is. They willingly donated this large amount of gold. Now, Gideon's decision to make an ephod. Remember, way back in the book of Leviticus, the ephod was this apron-like garment that was worn only by the high priest. This was an object to be revered. And so what Gideon is doing here is he's saying, make me this ephod. This is leading Israel back into idolatry. Remember Aaron, when Moses was up on Sinai, on the mountain, and the Israelites were down at the bottom of the mountain, and they said to Aaron, make for us a idol, a golden calf. Here we see the same thing with Gideon. He's making this golden idol that is going to lead Israel back into the sense of idolatry. If you remember when this account with Gideon started, it began with him tearing down the shrine of Baal under this oak tree that Gideon's father had a hand in. Gideon tore that down. His father converted, followed Yahweh as God. Now everything's come back full circle. Gideon's reconstructing this shrine to Baal and wearing this gold garment, this idol. Gideon, yeah, he refused kingship, but he was behaving more and more like a king all the time. He created something in his own image. He clothed himself in this idol with pagan materials, these golden earrings. This was going to become a spiritual snare to the Israelites. Gideon maybe thought he was doing something to help his people, but he was doing quite the opposite. Verse 27, Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his hometown, and all of Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there. And it became a snare to Gideon and his family. All this gold, which was fashioned into an ephah, was on public display in his town of Ophrah, just like the Baal altar was on display when this account began. Whatever this thing was that Gideon fashioned, it became an object of worship. And this was going to lead to another decline in the Israelites. So Gideon here has become the second official sponsor of idolatry, Aaron being the first with the golden calf, and now Gideon with his golden ephod, who was doing what was right in his own eyes. And thus Midian, verse 28, was subdued before the Israelites. It did not rise again. This was the end of the Midianites, and the land had peace for 40 years, Gideon's, the rest of his lifetime. This account of Gideon's defeat has come to a close. The land is resting for a period of 40 years. And this is the last period of peace that we are going to see mentioned in the book of Judges. And then this chapter wraps up with the death of Gideon and the introduction of Abimelech, which we're going to see tomorrow, the next judge. So verse 29, Jerubbaal, Gideon, son of Joash, went back home, and he lived, and he had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. Gideon, he enjoyed the fruit of his heroism for another 40 years, and he was wealthy enough to afford many wives who bore him 70 sons. Now, in this respect, again, Gideon is living like a king. Many of the Near Eastern kings at this time married many wives, fathered many children. Gideon was following this pagan culture and violating God's will that was received in the Mosaic law. He not only accumulated as much wealth as a king, now he's living like a king and collecting as many wives as he wanted and bearing many children, 70 children. Now, verse 31, his concubine, who lived in Shechem. Gideon also had a concubine in Shechem, which we're going to see tomorrow. The Canaanites controlled Shechem. So this reference appears to be that Gideon's concubine was a Canaanite. And according to tradition, her name was Druma. Remember, the Israelites, when they entered the Promised Land, were to eradicate the Canaanites. But now their leader, their judge, Gideon, has decided to marry one. His concubine, who lived in Shechem, bore him a son who he named Abimelech. The son that this concubine bore to Gideon had to have been a child of promise. Gideon named him Abimelech, which means, my father is king. Now, this name also may have been a nickname rather than a proper name, but this is going to be the next judge, Abimelech. Now, the sons of concubines, who Abimelech was born to this concubine, they usually didn't partake in the inheritances of their fathers. They were considered heirs of the family of the mother, not of the father. And so Abimelech was of a different inheritance status than Gideon's other 70 sons. So Gideon may have been hoping that this son would one day become king of Israel. But what we're going to see is that Abimelech, he not only perpetuated, he extended his father's bad practices. Gideon had become a very bad example for his son Abimelech. He said the right things, but he did all the wrong things. And so Gideon is, the end of his life, he's not going to finish well. He's refusing kingship on a formal level in word, but in practice, he's living like a king. Gideon, verse 32, son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Gideon eventually dies. His survivors, his family, bury him in this ancestral tomb. And after Gideon's death, the cycle begins again. The Israelites again will wander away from the Lord. Verse 33. No sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal Bereit as their god. They did not remember the Lord their God who had rescued them from the hand of their enemies on every side, the Midianites. They even made a covenant with this Baal. Baal Bereit, it means Baal of the covenant. A Baal is a god. So rather than Yahweh being the God of the covenant, here they made this pagan god and named him God of the covenant, Baal Bereit. And in Shechem, ironically, if you recall in Joshua, twice, Joshua 8 and Joshua 24, Shechem is where the Israelites renewed their covenant with Yahweh, the God of the covenant. Now it's become a center of Baal worship. Verse 35, they also failed to show any loyalty to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in spite of all the good things he had done. Over time, the Israelites forgot. They forgot Gideon. They forgot Yahweh. They forgot Yahweh's deliverances of them. They forgot this hero who they wanted to raise up to the status of king. And they worshipped this false god, the God of the covenant, Baal Bereit. And that brings this account to a close. Now, Gideon personifies the typical Israelite in the period of Judges. He is more than half Canaanite in his views. He doesn't know how to relate to God. He didn't know how to get involved in the Lord's work. He failed in his belief and trust in Yahweh many times. But Gideon is a good reference for us that God can use anybody, even in spite of ourselves, to get his work done, to get God's work done. If we are willing to submit, as Gideon did, God would accomplish his will through who he chooses, which is what happened with Gideon. The downside of that is that it all went to his head. He pushed God out of the picture. He became a ruthless tyrant. He lived as a king, even though he said he didn't want to be one. Now his legacy is forgotten. God is forgotten. They've created a false god, Baal Bereit. They've named him God of the covenant. And tomorrow we're going to see the next judge, Gideon's son from a concubine, Abimelech, come up next in this line of judges. So that is Judges chapter 8. I pray that has been a help to you, and I appreciate you being here tonight, being part of this study. Again, tomorrow we'll look at chapter 9 and we'll look at the account of Abimelech, the next judge in line. So thank you for being here tonight. I pray you have a wonderful evening. Stay safe and stay healthy. And I look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Until then, take care and God bless. Bye bye.